Hopefully everybody feels a little bit uh, more relaxed. Hopefully you didn't start drinking your lunch on the third day. So I know we've covered a lot of material, but hopefully you are, it's fitting in together a little bit, and you know where to find things that you're not sure about. So we're going to do the second small part of the housing programs, and then we're going to move into economic development. So we're on the downhill slope here. So the first part of housing, we talked about more traditional housing programs, and we reference these as being voluntary. But we're going to kind of switch gears here, and I never thought that involuntary was a great name for this, but it does kind of, because we're looking at an area and a more comprehensive approach, it's sort of less about an individual hearing about a program and signing up for it, sort of thing. It's more of a strategic approach to a particular targeted area and trying to make an impact on that area with sort of a little bit broader of an approach on things that might be done. So involuntary, excuse me, the involuntary program is not only housing, but it's some related activities that would have a more of an impact in a targeted area. Now, this has been around in the Kentucky program for a long time, and it originally included eminent domain, but we talked about earlier that we have this limitation in place that wasn't originally there on kind of further restricting when the actual use of eminent domain can be used, and housing is something that eminent domain cannot be used on, but we might be doing infrastructure and other things that would relate to housing, and so we still could have some eminent domain as part of an overall approach. So the areas for the focus of the involuntary program have to be designated. They have to follow the Kentucky Urban Renewal and Redevelopment Law. We're not going to go into the details on that. But activities that could be included in this would be acquisition and then some kind of rehab. It could include conversion. It also could be demolition and reconstruction. And we'll talk more about some of those elements. So things that we cannot or that we can do under this would also include demolition and clearance. Obviously, if we're trying to make an impact on an area, sometimes in addition to working on structures that we're going to use for housing or other sort of public uses, being able to go in and clear out some of the blighting influences in that area can really help to kind of turn around a particular target area. And that would include covering the costs of disposition of property. So we might buy something, clear it, clean it up, and then sell it, dispose of it. We could also do multifamily rehabilitation under this. And depending on who the applicant was, and there are only certain subrecipients that actually fit this criteria, we might be able to do new housing construction. Now, I will say that CDBG does allow for CDBG funds to be used in support of new construction. So it could be that we would acquire, demo, clear a site, and then dispose of it. And it could be disposed or sold to someone who was going to then do redevelopment on that site. And so we might be supporting that with some infrastructure that was related to that. And then single family owner programs and rental rehab are also part of this. And a lot of times some infrastructure or site improvements are combined with this. We might need, this might be a neighborhood that has not seen any reinvestment in a long time. So maybe, putting in sidewalks or replacing sidewalks or dealing with flood and drainage issues, those sorts of things could be really important on trying to have some redevelopment happen in that area. So national objective on this. So most of what we're going to see under this would be the LMI housing national objective. So we talked in the housing section earlier about meeting that national objective would mean that every single family would have to be occupied by an LMI household. If we had a double one side of that, and then when we get to 3 or more units, it's that 51% rule that's going to apply. And of course, we're going to be using our Section 8 income definition to determine if those households actually qualify within the current limits, and we'll have all of that documented in the file. So the first day we did talk about some other national objectives, and there are some times when it might be part of an involuntary housing project. So slum and blight is an option where we would be able to, instead of making this eligible based on LMI individuals that were assisted, slum and blight would allow us to qualify this based on our investment of CDBG funds is going to eliminate those blighting influences. So under slum and blight, we could be acquiring, demoing, clearing, and then that site could be redeveloped. We've met that national objective by eliminating those blighting influences. That property then could be reused and would not be restricted to benefiting an LMI household because we did it under slum and blight as opposed to doing it under the national objective of LMI. So the order of municipal resolution would also have to state that the area meets the Kentucky law on that. All right. So also under national objectives, for an urban renewal or development plan, that's going to be required if we have public funds that are being used on private property, and then a public purpose that's being invoked on condemnation of a property. So we talked about if we were going through condemnation, which is the eminent domain process, we would have to be able to show, to be eligible to use eminent domain, that there was a public purpose as part of that. We could also have a grantee that owns land and wants to sell that surplus property to do a disposition. And so in those cases, that urban renewal and development plan would be required. There is a sample in the handbook. And keep in mind that if we are going to sell land for less than fair market value, then we have to be able to document that below market sale was a public purpose, and that would have to be called out within that plan. So kind of the differences between involuntary versus the voluntary we were talking about this morning. For involuntary, the assistance must be provided in the form of a grant. If we have single family units that are acquired and rehabbed, they will have to be sold to LMI buyers unless there was prior approval from DLG. We will be requiring 5-year residency again for home buyer units, and rental units again will have to be occupied by LMI folks at an affordable rent. That's going to be defined by DLG, and then again, it's a period of 5 years. We need to have maintenance language in place in the agreement. And then, of course, our good friend URA, acquisition and relocation rules, they are going to apply both for involuntary and voluntary on this. All right. So special issues for rental housing. We talked about the fact that under CDBG, to meet that national objective for rental housing, we have to have 51% of those units being occupied by LMI households, and they would need to be affordable. And so DLG is defining affordable as meeting or being below, at or below the HUD fair market rent. So when you see HUD publish their annual rent schedule, they annually provide income levels. They also do rents, and they will identify the fair market rent. So those are not something you have to calculate yourself. They are available. Keep in mind, and we talked yesterday, I think, about Davis-Bacon requirements. So Davis-Bacon requirements are triggered when we have 8 or more units in a project. That will, that'll have an impact on the oversight responsibilities. It also may have an impact on the cost of that project. So knowing whether it's going to be a Davis-Bacon project or not will have an impact on kind of estimating the cost on something like that. And of course, relocation is going to apply for any tenants that might be either permanently or temporarily displaced. So similar to what we talked about under the voluntary section, and we aren't really going to go back through those details, but those same rules apply about needing to have clear program guidelines in place to clearly define who's going to be an eligible applicant, the properties that are going to be available, those property standards. So at the end of our project, we've brought each of those properties up to our standards. That would be called out, included in our guideline and our program design. All of what we talked about with the lead paint is also going to apply to this. And then, those oversight responsibilities on, overseeing the procurement process or contracting, the construction management on that. And so I would just refer you, we aren't going to go back over those items. There's good information in the handbook, and so I would refer you there. All right, so that finished up our housing section, and we're going to go ahead and move right into our economic development section. And I don't know if we have as many people that are doing economic development, but economic development is one of those things. I think if you were to talk to the folks on the street and what the number one need might be for communities, a lot of folks would say it's having good paying jobs that are available for folks, particularly if you're in non-urban areas. I know I live in a community where folks are saying, how do we make it possible for our kids to be able to stay here and have a good living? So economic development, CDBG has a role in not only retaining businesses, but also to help make new ventures viable. And we'll talk about what we get in exchange for that investment of CDBG funds. So we have a number of ways that are going to fit under that umbrella of economic development activities. And so we might be providing economic development for public or nonprofit entities. We might be working with neighborhood-based or other nonprofits. Probably the traditional model, and the one I think that's most likely to be seen, is what we call special economic development, where we are providing typically it's in the form of a loan to a for-profit business, and they might be creating a new business, they might be creating a new business location, or we could be expanding their operations and adding jobs in that community. We also will talk a little bit about micro enterprise development. So a micro enterprise is defined as having 5 or fewer employees, and that includes the owner. So a lot of our startup businesses might fit within micro enterprise development. And we've got some additional flexibility that comes along with that micro enterprise development category that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then public facilities can be related or support economic development. And that might be, we're talking about getting water, sewer, utilities to that site, but it also could be things like we're going to have a jobs training center or daycare or something that's going to be related to that. All right, so things that we can't do. So this is in the world of CDBG, which hasn't changed dramatically over the years. This is one of the newer sort of things. So job pirating. So this became an issue. Probably you all in the state you're in have heard of, there's a possibility that in Ohio, it was Honda coming to Ohio. And so every community was lined up trying to figure out, how do we attract them? How do we put together a package of incentives that will make them want to choose our community to invest all this money and create a bunch of jobs? And so what was being experienced across the country was we were seeing communities that included CDBG funds in that sort of package of benefits to encourage a employer to locate in their community. But sometimes that investment in one community with CDBG was actually simply removing jobs from somewhere else, and they were relocating. So in the big picture of things, we're spending federal dollars. We're not really creating new jobs. We're simply moving them out of one community and into another. And so once this was recognized that there was sort of a trend happening with CDBG, they chose to put in the job pirating regulations in place. So this is triggered when we have a company that is relocating that company, and we're deeming that job loss to be significant. And there are two tests on that. We're not going to go into the details on that, but essentially it's looking at a certain number of jobs or a percentage of the overall labor force in that area. So if based on that criteria, the loss of jobs that are going to be caused by this company coming to your community and is going to cause those job losses in another community, then we're going to categorize this as job pirating, and you would not be able to put your funding into this. So that can require you essentially to be analyzing, okay, is this, so let's say I have let's say it's a warehouse distribution center. For a while, that was really popular. And so if someone is saying to you, let's say Walmart wants to create a new distribution warehouse in your community, the question then becomes, is this a new facility and new jobs that are being created, or are you, shifting or maybe consolidating from other locations? And so we're having to ask those questions on that. And in some cases, it's simply we're adding a new facility. And so we would be able to document that in our file and show that that is not triggering this job pirating on that. So you would need to have a process to be asking those questions and have that documentation in the file to be able to show. Now, a lot of times we're dealing with startup businesses or an existing enterprise that's simply expanding at their existing site. And those clearly are also going to be outside of that job pirating category. So let's talk a little bit about meeting the national objective. So projects to be eligible for funding, it has to be an eligible activity, which we talked about our economic development activities in some variety of how we would do that. But then also DLG is going to be reviewing that application and determining whether that project will meet a national objective. Probably most of our projects are going to be on LMI jobs, and we'll talk about the details on that. But there is a possibility that we might be doing something that's supporting economic development under maybe slum and blight as part of that. So we can kind of talk through that. But based on that, what the national objectives that we're trying to meet will then determine the types of data that we need to collect to be able to document that we're actually meeting that criteria. So I think the most common national objective that we would be using would be the LMI job creation or retention. This is an important point. I would know where to find this. So these are activities that either we're creating jobs, and at least 51% of those jobs are going to be held by a low, moderate income person, or we could be, because of our investment, being able to retain those jobs. So we might have a situation where there was an economic risk, and if it weren't for our investment, those jobs would be lost. For some of you that are going to be receiving disaster funding, you might be assisting existing businesses under retainage. And then we would be collecting data to be able to show that if it weren't for this investment of funding, that those jobs would be lost. When we talk about jobs and when we count jobs to make that 51% calculation, keep in mind that they are permanent full-time jobs. So we might be working, let's say we were assisting a grocery store and they have a mix of some of their jobs are full-time, some of their jobs are part-time. If we've got 10 part-time jobs that are working, like 20 hours a week, that's going to be the equivalent of 5 full-time jobs. So we're going to have to make those into equivalency for full-time jobs on that. And so if we are dealing with job retention, again, we're going to need to be able to clearly show that if it were not for that investment, so that could be things like public notification. I've had at a company that had a repeated flooding issue that was related to drainage issues in the street. And so that company issued a letter from their headquarters to that local unit of government saying, if you're not able to resolve this issue within this length of time, we will be closing down and relocating our business. And so we had clear evidence on that, but it also could be a financial analysis where we have a company, a business that's in jeopardy, and we would be looking at their financials to see that they were not going to be viable unless they were able to, maybe get a reinvestment in inventory or capital on that. All right, so for job creation and retention, we need to make sure that we have a written not only commitment to create those jobs or retain them, but there's a plan in place. So we're going to be talking about, the process of how we count those jobs and when that's done, how long we count them. So those would be the sorts of things that would be included in that hiring plan. If they're going to create 20 jobs, we need them to be actively working to try to make sure that at least 51% of those jobs are going to end up being held by folks at 51 or at 80% or below of area median income. And this isn't something that we would just want to wait till, maybe we give them 2 years to create those jobs. I would not want to wait till the end of 2 years and ask them, hey, how are things going? We're going to be checking in with them, making sure that they are moving forward on that. Also making sure, sometimes there's a change of staffing and the person that was originally there understood about this hiring plan and was following what was required. We need to make sure that that continues throughout that period. So I already mentioned about it's got to be full-time equivalents, it's permanent jobs, it's not seasonal. So, if we had let's say we had a company that shipped out like fruit baskets or something, boxes at Christmas time, and a lot of their staff was going to be hired on a seasonal basis. Those are not going to be counted as full-time equivalent jobs. Last bullet point here is kind of important. So essentially, the CDBG program is going to report back to HUD and the public that, with this investment, we created this number of jobs. So they want you to keep counting as jobs are being created that are related to that investment. So there's not this, I think most of us would say, okay, if my written agreement says that I need to create 50 jobs and they have to be in this 51% LMI, if I got to the 50th job and they were in that 51% mix that I needed, I would be wanting to close the books and say we're done. But CDBG wants you to keep count. So if you actually end up hiring 60 people based on this CDBG investment, we want to count those jobs and take credit for that. So there's this ongoing counting until hiring drops off or the hiring seems to be related to not this investment, but maybe something else. Maybe your company now has a contract with some vendor to produce a new product. And so it's completely unrelated to the CDBG investment that was made. And so it's having some kind of basis to say, okay, this is why we stopped counting, because we believe any future job growth is related to something other than the CDBG investment. So other national objectives we might be doing on this, we'll mention in some examples of things like we could have a let's say a grocery store is probably the best example, where we're providing goods and services for that area. So if we have, maybe we have a food desert where we have an area where residents don't have easy access to a grocery provider. So having that grocery store locate within an LMI area, we'd be able to go through the area benefit calculation, defining what our service area was, the number of LMI residents in that area, and then be able to justify our investment based on that service area and providing services. So we'll when we get into the public benefit calculation, we'll talk a little further about that. We also, under limited clientele, which is one of our subsets of our LMI national objective, a micro enterprise owner, if they themselves are LMI, they qualify then as a limited clientele, meaning that because we were able to qualify that owner, we don't have to then count the number of jobs. We don't have to see that, you know, if they, as they grow and they add a few more jobs, we don't have to get the documents on 51% of those hires being qualifying. Simply on the income of the microenterprise owner or owners, we would be able to qualify that as meeting a national objective. So that kind of helps. And then sometimes when we're doing projects that are in support of economic development, and I think a daycare center job training is probably the best examples on those, that we would be able to document the clientele who is benefiting from that. So I know for some of the economic development projects I was working on, because of the, you know, kind of higher tech equipment that folks were using, they needed some training to be able to operate that equipment. And so there was a jobs training program that was making applicants essentially job ready, and they were being hired from that job training program by the employer. And so if that is done under limited clientele, and we're looking at the income of at least 51% of those participants, same thing with childcare, we would be able to meet the national objective in that way. And then slum and blight, we probably don't see this a lot, but let's say you have in an area of town, you have some buildings that are in poor repair. And so under slum and blight, we might go in, clean them up, address the code issues on this, and make them essentially ready for reinvestment, so someone else to come in. And so that might be what is attracting a business to come in. So we might be able to qualify that investment on that area and perhaps a building under spot slum and blight. That's something we don't see a lot, and so it would be important to work with DLG on that to go through the details and make sure that that's all going to be eligible. So in all cases, we're going to need to have a legally binding agreement in place. With most of our projects, we're going to be requiring that owner of the company be over time agreeing, pledging to create jobs. We may have taken a security position on some of their assets to back that up. And so we need to have a legally binding agreement in place, excuse me, which lays out all of the minimum requirements for all of the parties that are involved in that project. So there are three main components of that agreement. Might want to know what those were. first area is simply laying out what is this project, what are the details of the project itself, and then laying out all the provisions that are required in Section 7 of the grant agreement. So we know that some of the things we talked when we were talking about the HUD regulations, that we're passing those down from HUD to DLG to a grantee, sometimes to a subrecipient, and in some cases, some of those requirements would also pass on to a for-profit business of requirements that they would be responsible for implementing. And so some of those items in Section 7 would be included in that. And then also we need to have that statement that that agreement is contingent upon a release of funds. So we said, we cannot expend any CDBG funds until we have the environmental review process completed and have achieved that release of funds. So we'd want this conditional statement within that binding agreement. In addition to that, there would need to be a resolution of authority and then also an opinion from the grantee's local council. We'll talk about the details on closing on these in a minute. So for the loan or lease documents, and we do have projects where we would have a local entity that would be using CDBG funds to either purchase or create a facility, then they would be leasing those to the business. We need to make sure that those are in a separate agreement and they're going to clearly call out the rate and term, all of the payment terms, what would trigger this loan to be considered to be in default, and then any of the other special conditions, provisions that would apply to this. And again, that opinion of legal counsel, and that will need to be filed with the county clerk. So they'll be filed on record. So let's talk a little bit about security. So on these projects, you as the grantee do have a liability. So to make, if I'm loaning funds, I'll use my frozen pizza manufacturer. So if I'm providing CDBG funds to that company in a loan, and they're going to, maybe they're going to expand their facility, they're going to purchase machinery and equipment, and they're now adding another line to make frozen pizza. Maybe before they were making frozen pasta, and now it's pizza. So if they would fail to create the jobs that are needed to meet that national objective, failing to meet that national objective would mean that funds have to be repaid. It would have to be repaid to DLG, and DLG would have to repay that to HUD. So communities often will then want to securitize their loan by having a lien position on some other property. So that might be a lien on a mortgage or other assets. I've had projects where we would not close because the owner of the company had transferred all of his assets to the wife, and the wife would not sign on to the security agreement. And so there was nothing backing up, leaving the local community holding the bag if something went south with this project. So we need to clearly identify what is being used as security on this and the position that the grantee would have on that. So if it's a mortgage, it would have a clear legal description, certification that they actually own that, and then indemnity and claims that were filed against that particular property. Sometimes it might be a piece of equipment or other assets, and so we would want the pertinent information about that. And then again, that's going to get filed with the county clerk, or it might be with a state agency, but we have securitized that project by having a lien or a call position on an asset that would back up the risk, financial risk that we have for that. So a loan closing is required. And as part of that, all the required documents need to be prepared, including real property transfer information, the security documents that we just talked about. And so grantees are required to notify DLG in advance that they have an intent to close, that they've declared the date that everything needs to be in order, and they need to submit all the evidence to DLG to be reviewed in advance of that projected closing date. So I would be working with DLG on this. I think we have Gabe on the call who is handling the economic development programs. I would get to know him and just be checking in with him so he can help you with some guidance on this to make sure that you stay on the right path on this. So for public benefit, and we're going to be talking more about what we mean about this, there's a financial analysis that's required for not only the traditional, but also the non-traditional economic development projects. And there's really two aspects of that. One is the ratio of public versus private funding. So deciding how much money, how many CDBG dollars do they actually need for this project. We're trying to make sure we're not over subsidizing, but also not under subsidizing these projects. But we also have a public benefit standard test that needs to be done. And we're going to be talking about that in some detail. It's something I want you to understand when we're done with that. And that's going to be based on looking at the benefits in either jobs created or goods and services that are being provided. We'll go through the details on that in just a minute. All right, so when we're looking at that, at what their request is and trying to underwrite the level of funding, there are guidelines within the CDBG or regulations on this for evaluating that cost and financial requirements. And essentially it's setting up to be able to underwrite this as any other lender would to determine, is this a deal that I feel is an appropriate risk for us to take? And what's the need for funding? What might the terms for this be? So when we look at the amount of KCDBG funds that are being requested, we have to look at what are all their needs for this, what's the total dollars that they need on this versus what are the resources that they have available. And that would include looking at their other financing options, look at what's going to be reasonable for them to cover as far as debt for that project. We not only do not want to give them too much in CDBG dollars, but we also don't want to have them that they are going to be so close to the edge on being able to meet all of their obligations that they're an unstable business from the beginning and much more likely to fail. So we want to make sure that they have sufficient financing, some of that coming from us and also coming from other private sources on that. So as part of that criteria, we'd be looking at, what are all the costs in this project? Are they all reasonable? And are they an efficient use of funds? So we mentioned a couple of different times we talked about on day one about, our investments always have to be cost reasonable. And so this is again where, since we're not going to require this private company when they buy the pizza machines that they're going to use to manufacture with, they're not triggering federal procurement, but we need some way to be able to evaluate, is this a reasonable normal cost for this piece of equipment? And so we need to assemble that information. Also looking at a reasonable return. And so this is looking at, they're going to be saying to you, these are my expenses, this amount of money I need for this, but also we expect our sales to be, these are going to be our costs over time. And so this is the return that they're going to be making on that investment. For a high return, we are then probably going to say, well, we need some of our funds or all of our funds to be in the form of a loan because we're not wanting to over subsidize you and have you earn a really high return on this, you're going to have the ability to pay on this. So we're analyzing what they've provided to us. That can be a little tricky when we have a startup company, and sometimes to be able to justify the amount of money that they are asking for, they're going to give you very large numbers for what they think their sales will be, and really low, maybe lowballing the expenses. And part of your analysis is looking at, do I think these are logical and rational? So we're trying to make sure this is a feasible project. If we make this investment, will those jobs be able to be created? Will this business be able to be sustainable? So let's talk a little bit about this disbursement on a pro rata basis. So essentially, we want to make sure that, let's say in the example, we have the owner of the company who is pledged as part of the resources that they're going to be putting money in. They also have a bank loan for part of this project, and then the CDBG funds. We want to see that all parties are putting their money in a proportional timing on this. So we don't want to be the front end person that we are the only people at risk with the public dollars, and only later, we sometimes have owners saying, well, let's use the public dollars, let's use the bank's money that would be at risk, and only at the end am I going to actually open up my bank account and put any dollars in. And so generally we're seeing that you would require that as those expenses are recognized, that those contributions would come in on a pro rata basis. And so that underwriting criteria then would also be part of how you determine what are the loan terms going to be, what would the length of the loan, the amortization period, what's the interest rate going to be on that, and then over time, as those payments are made, you will be reporting on the repayments that are coming in on that portfolio of loans. So that's the underwriting, the CDBG regulations on this. But now let's also talk about the separate set on the CDBG requirements about public benefit standard. And this is one I want you to mark. So this is where we also, in addition to meeting that national objective, we have to be able to justify the level of our investment based on that public benefit that's going to be created by that benefit. So either the jobs that are going to be created for the investment that we're putting in, or goods and services. So we mentioned that we might be supporting the opening of a grocery store in a neighborhood. And so instead of looking at jobs, we might be able to justify our investment based on the goods and services that LMI members of that service area would be accessing. So we'll look at some examples on this. So we have a cap that is in place. So under the dollars per job benefit, you would be taking your total investment and then dividing it in to the number of jobs that are being either created or retained. And remember, that's full-time equivalent. So we might have 40 jobs, but 10 of those are actually part-time. So it might be that we have only 5 full-time equivalents. So our number will be adjusted a little bit for that. And our cap on this, our maximum, is $20,000 per job created. So if we're creating 100 jobs, the most our investment could be would be 100 times 20,000 per job. And so that's one of our tests that we would be doing. And so that's going to limit the amount of investment that you could make. So I'll use the example of the grocery store. The grocery store might be a relatively small operation, have a number of part-time jobs. So when we did the math on that and capping per job at $20,000, we might be limited at a relatively low number to be able to assist them. And maybe they've determined that with all of the needs for cash, their ability to be able to borrow, maybe their gap that they're asking for is $200,000. This calculation under job benefit might say the most you can provide them is $150,000 based on the jobs that we believe can actually be created. So the other important concept is here, Under public benefit standard, we need to meet one of these. So we could, with the same project, we could run the dollar per job calculation, come up with what our maximum benefit is, but we also then can run it based on goods and services. So for goods and services, instead of looking at jobs, we're looking at that service area that we've defined for that company and calculated the number of LMI people that are in that service area. And so we're going to take our proposed investment of CDBG funds, divide it by that number of LMI that we've determined for that service area, and then the maximum investment would be $350 per person for that. So in that grocery store example, if our jobs calculation on public benefit standards said the maximum we could invest was 150. If we had a large population of LMI in that area, it might be that our calculation, even though it's a lower number, this 350, we're not multiplying that times jobs, we're multiplying that times population. We might come up with, maybe 250,000 is our cap on being able to invest funding. And so for that $200,000 that was needed, we could make that eligible using our goods and services calculation. So that documentation would need to be in the file, and it would be part of your process of determining what's the maximum that I can provide for this company in the case that it is not adequate to fill that gap. And without that total investment, this isn't going to be feasible. You may have to walk away from that project unless they can find other funds to take the place of that. So we mentioned that sometimes public facilities are part of that. For the economic development work that I did at the state level, a lot of it was actually infrastructure, getting water and sewer, sometimes getting roadways or rail spurs connected to an industrial site would be what they were doing. If this is costing $10,000 or less per job, then we aren't triggering the standards on this. All right, so in documenting that public benefit, we're going to, of course, have that application, all the details about this. You would have your calculation, be able to show how that you completed one of these calculations that they met that amount, or maybe you've done both of them. And that would all be in the file to document that that's how you found this to be eligible, not only meeting a national objective, but it's within the bounds of our public benefit calculation on that. Some other requirements that are going to apply, keep in mind all of these are CDBG dollars. So all of our regular requirements are going to apply, but also this includes environmental review. We talked about program income. So if we make this in the form of a loan to the company, if it's coming back to the grantee or the subrecipient, it's going to be program income. If the payment's coming back to an LDA, a local development agency or authority, then that's going to be not considered to be program income. That was the exclusion that we talked about under A115, I believe. Our procurement and contracting may or may not apply. We talked about procurement. Federal procurement is not applying to that private entity when they are purchasing something, but the fact that we still need to have cost reasonableness documented. And then we have things like Section 3 or other things that might apply to that project that would go along with that. And then, of course, our favorite acquisition relocation does apply, and of course the equal opportunity requirements on this. So our financial management, again, all of the rules about drawdowns, making sure that we have procedures in place, not having money sitting in the local account, following all of the requirements with the agreements, the leases, loans, and the security, all of that become part of that grant manager's responsibility. Labor standards, do apply generally, except we may have some projects that would be where there's no construction involved, so we might be only funding working capital. So I think when we get to some disaster projects that are doing economic development projects supporting existing businesses, those are probably generally going to be working capital, and so they would not be triggering our labor standards. And then we also sometimes have equipment. Now, on equipment, and this may have been mentioned under Davis-Bacon, I don't at this point remember. In some cases, particularly when we get into economic development and larger scale manufacturing, that equipment installation is actually, it's not like I'm picking up a new dishwasher at Lowe's and installing it in my kitchen, that the installation is major and becomes part of the construction on that. So there is an equipment analysis on determining whether it's triggering Davis-Bacon or not. And I would recommend that you interact with DLG and confer with them on that when there are any questions on that. All right, so I do not see any questions in the hopper here. So I think we can move right on to Andelin. Good afternoon, Andelin.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Les. And we'll go right into chapter 12, which is amendments and monitoring. All right, I'm just trying to grab the ball here so that I can move the slides forward. All right, and here we go. All right, so monitoring and amendments. A project or budget amendment is triggered by a change in the approved budget for a project, um, or a change in the purpose, scope, location, or a change in the beneficiaries of an activity. So amendments do require approval from DLG. Grantees are advised to contact DLG if any problems emerge that might lead to project modifications, or if any change is contemplated. So very early notification is key here in order to think through all of the things that may be triggered or may be affected by an amendment. Because grants were selected for funding based on the proposed project, the amendment will be reviewed carefully by DLG, and the grantee will be notified of approval or disapproval. But it's very important that the grantee not proceed with the requested changes until the grantee, does receive written approval from DLG. So that's very, very important. Um, the request for project or budget amendment form is attachment 12-1 in the handbook. That must be completed, signed by the mayor, county judge, or the agency executive, and submitted to DLG. There is a project budget amendment checklist also in Chapter 12 of the CDBG handbook that can be very helpful and outlines the items that are changing versus the actions or requirements that may be triggered as a result of that change. All right, so substantial amendments. Upon receipt of that project or budget amendment form, DLG is going to determine if the proposed change constitutes a substantial amendment. So there are amendments and then there are substantial amendments that require a bit more action. So the determination as to whether the amendment is considered substantial is going to be important because it's going to dictate whether, due to the size and magnitude of the change, whether additional CDBG requirements are triggered, right? So some examples may be state clearinghouse assurance, that may need updating, notification to the public. So Title I of the Housing and Community Development Act requires that citizens must be provided reasonable advance notice of and the opportunity to comment on substantial changes to any CDBG project. So that means that if the amendment is substantial, it may need to go back out for a public hearing and may involve some citizen participation. I know that you learned about an environmental review this morning. Additional environmental review requirements may absolutely be triggered as the result of a change. One example was I was working with the City of Columbia and we were doing a parks project, so parks improvement project, and we were upgrading playground equipment and trash receptacles and adding some walking paths. Halfway through the project, well, a little less than halfway through the project, we realized just through conversation with our Parks and Recreation Department that they were also daylighting a stream at the same time. They had not told us about this originally, but because that was a part of the overall project, then they had just left it out for because they were using some other funding for it, but it was still part of one project. We had to stop everything, do the entire environmental review again, and that took a lot of time and actually affected our timeliness for that year. So that can be a really big deal. So again, the earlier that you can contact DLG and get started and understand what's possibly triggered by an amendment, definitely the better there. All right. Sometimes, and Les alluded to this yesterday, sometimes projects do come in less than planned. So it's not an overage for like a change order, but it's an amendment where it's less. The project costs are less than anticipated. You still need to contact DLG. They still need to approve and review and approve that project amendment form. As with other types of amendments, even projects coming in less or under budget might trigger some other requirements. So still very important that you complete that amendment form, let DLG review it and approve it and see if anything else is triggered before you move forward. All right, let's talk about monitoring. So DLG aims to assist and support grantees in complying with the program regulations, state and federal, local laws, and in making sure that their projects come in on budget and under in time. So to that end, DLG does provide ongoing technical assistance and training. Staff are available to answer questions, application documents, and workshops are held. There's the KCDBG handbook also there to offer assistance, and there's lots of other resources on their website. They also hold regular trainings. But one other way that they offer this technical assistance and are there to help is through monitoring. So DLG performs monitoring reviews to ensure that approved activities are carried out in a timely manner, that activities are conducted in compliance with the objectives and regulations of the program, and to ensure that grantees show continuing capacity to carry out the project in a timely manner. So monitoring can be carried out via desk review, review of documents at DLG. We call that a desk monitoring through on-site visits, or sometimes a combination of both might be appropriate. All right, so let's talk about the monitoring process a little bit. There are some steps that are going to happen in the monitoring process. First, DLG will schedule the visit. That's not on the slide here, but first DLG will schedule the visit. So the CEO of the grantee, as well as the grant administrator, should be notified of the date, time, location, and purpose of the review. Are they there to review CDBG or maybe another program? But you will be notified of the purpose of the review. Then, the day of the review, there will be an entrance meeting. So on site, DLG will conduct an entrance meeting where they will state the purpose of the review again, outline which files and documentation they're going to need in order to review them. And grantees will have the opportunity at that time to provide an overview of the project status, and give information about any issues that may have happened. You can do that at that time prior to the beginning of the monitoring. Then monitoring will officially begin. DLG will utilize appropriate checklists to go ahead and monitor those files. The primary areas that are going to be examined include consistency with specific terms of the actual grant agreement. So very important that you're reading those grant agreements and making sure that you're doing everything that that was agreed to there. Um, Compliance with state and federal requirements, compliance with CDBG requirements. Record keeping is the most important component of monitoring. I've said this over and over. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen, and your files should read like a book. Someone should be able to come later who wasn't there and just be able to follow what happened by following your file. So records should be orderly, complete, and of course, ready for review. They should be on site, ready for review. If there are areas that are discovered during the review that indicate noncompliance with laws, regulations, and other um, statutory requirements, that may result in a finding, which is, I think, the highest level of issues there is a finding. So a finding of noncompliance must be remedied. It can result in a sanction if corrective action isn't taken in the specified time frame or manner. Um, and for each finding, DLG is going to indicate the corrective action. They're going to tell you what the corrective action will be, either to correct a past problem or to avoid a future problem. They're going to tell you what you need to do there. A deficiency in the program performance that's not based on the statutory laws and regulations is called a concern. So a corrective action is not necessarily required for concerns, but DLG may recommend actions to address those concerns, and certainly you would want to carry those out. And then matters that aren't yet an issue, but if they're not properly addressed, can become a finding and may ultimately result in sanctions. Those are called recommendations. They're often used to point out any operational deficiencies or problems, patterns that, again, could lead to problems in the future. So you want to pay attention to those as well. All right. So most of the chapters in the handbook do have a portion on monitoring for that specific um, uh, topic. And so you want to go back through and look at each of the topics, each of the chapters, and look at the monitoring under those chapters. All right. The next thing that's going to happen is the exit meeting or interview. Um, at the conclusion of the review, DLG staff will conduct an exit, well, may conduct an exit interview. Um, the meeting typically includes the same folks that were there in the entrance meeting. They'll point out any problems that are apparent, any findings or concerns that are apparent. They may go back to the office and change it slightly or find something that they didn't find while they were on site, and that does happen. But for the most part, the things that they go through in the exit meeting are going to be the things that you need to pay attention to that were the results of your monitoring. All right. Then lastly, you'll get a review letter and follow-up action. So you'll receive a formal letter giving you the results of the review, generally within 30 days after the monitoring. And that's going to summarize the areas reviewed and the performance expectations. It's going to provide a summary of what was discovered during the review and list any corrective actions for those findings. So this is really, really important. The grantee must respond in writing within 30 days to any findings or recommendations listed in that compliance review letter. Okay, you have 30 days to respond. Describe all corrective actions that were taken or provide new information not reviewed during the visit. The corrective actions should be consistent with what DLG suggested. The grantee's chief executive officer must certify that all regulations will be observed in future transactions and provide assurance that no adverse effects happened from the failure to observe the regulations in the first place. If issues aren't resolved, DLG may impose sanctions, including additional reporting, suspension of funding, additional special conditions, return of disallowed expenditures, termination of the grant, or even legal action. So it could get very, very serious. DLG is going to, after you return that findings letter within 30 days after you respond to it and let them know what you did to correct your actions, DLG will inform the grantee if the response is sufficient to clear the findings. Okay, and of course, DLG is there to assist along the way if you need any help with those corrective actions. All right, that's the monitoring process. I know that was a lot of information on that last slide, but I think very, very important information for you to know exactly how that day of monitoring will go. Les?
Before we jump into the next section, we have a couple of questions that have come in that are related to economic development. So I thought I would, before we go further, take care of those, and then we can move into the closeout. So good questions coming through. So there was a question about how long do the standards for job creation need to be effective for, or does a one-time study done at the time of application? So a couple of things here. So first off, um, if we're talking about job creation, you're doing an analysis on determining how many jobs need to be created to support the amount of funding that you're committing towards this project. And you probably want to be conservative on this. It's not uncommon in economic development, particularly in a startup, to have them say, oh, we are going to create 150 jobs right away, and we are going to have millions in sales the first year. It's just going to be a huge immediate success. Your underwriting on this will take that with a grain of salt, perhaps, and figure out what you think is reasonable as an expectation. And then when you're looking at that jobs number, kind of taking that into effect. So you might have, the owner of the company might be saying, we're going to create 100 jobs. If you're underwriting on the public benefit standard, determine that for the amount of money that they need, that you're proposing and putting in, you need 20 jobs. I might have my written agreement be something closer to that, so that you then are being able to document. But that's a front end on determining how much money to provide for that project. But on compliance on the back end, we need to be able to know that we meet that national objective. We need to be able to demonstrate that they actually did hire the required number of jobs, and that we're in that mix of at least 51% of those were LMI. So we might have a project that your eligibility was established that they had to create 20 jobs, and they get to a point where they say there are no jobs, no additional jobs being created. And when you review the documentation, you find that they actually only maybe hired 10 people instead of 20. And hopefully they are in the proportion of 51% of those are LMI. And you might be working with that company to determine, should we extend the job creation period? And you would, like, if you had an economic development deal right before the pandemic, probably they're not going to be creating the jobs in that period of time that you had designated. And so it might be that you would extend the job creation period on that. But you also may have businesses that say, it's over. We're not hiring any additional folks, and sometimes you might have, unfortunately, you could have something that they create no jobs. So that you're sort of recalculating for compliance on with the number of jobs that were created. So they create 10 instead of 20. What would be the maximum investment that under this public benefit standard you could have invested? And that's essentially your eligible investment in this project, and you would then be working with them to seek repayment for the balance of that, because you have CDBG funds that have been expended that don't meet a national objective because they were exceeding that public benefit standard. So that's probably more than you asked for in your question, but it does have a front end and a back end implication. And there were also there were a couple questions about when we talked about the job pirating. I didn't go into the detail on how do we determine whether this is a significant job loss. So there are two ways that this is done. If it is more than 500 jobs, or it's more than 0.1% of the workforce for that area. So, a small community, that 0.1% could be way less than 500 jobs. So you're having to make the calculation in both ways. The other thing that can be a little bit tricky on this is then determining what is the labor market. So particularly when we're in non-urban areas, is your labor market the city? Is it the county? Is it a couple county regions? And so I would confer with Gabe at DLG on this in trying to make that determination if you have a potential job pirating and you're making that calculation to make sure that they agree with your calculation on that. And I will say, just to expand on what I mentioned before, a lot of times there are a lot of questions asking about where are your other locations, what is intended with those jobs that are in the other locations, and trying to make that connection. And sometimes you will have for-profit companies that are less than cooperative on revealing what their business plans are for other locations, and will say, we have each of these is set up as a separate entity, but we're still trying to figure out, based on the CDBG rules and job loss, whether the jobs that they're projecting for your community are actually new jobs, or they actually are coming from these other locations. All right, I think that covers what's come in, and so I'll hand things back to Angela.
All right, thank you so much. We are going to go straight into project closeout. Now, let me get my slides here. All right, project closeout. So project closeout is a series of activities meant to verify that CDBG funds were properly spent, documented, and also meant to verify that the grant is ready to be closed. CDBG project closeout consists of a few key steps, including conducting a public hearing to inform citizens that the grant is complete and ready to be closed out. Completing and obtaining approval of the project completion report. We're going to talk a little bit more about that on the upcoming slides. And when applicable, submittal of an audit and resolution of any audit findings. So we're going to go into all of that in just a moment. Project closeout is triggered when a grantee has spent 100% of its case CDBG funds and when the project is complete. So both of those things need to be true in order for the project to be ready to be closed out. All right, conditions. The project closeout process may not be completed unless a CDBG national objective has been met. There are no outstanding monitoring findings on the project. Any real property that has been acquired has been disposed of according to CDBG requirements, and that all required audits have been approved. Okay. So those things are the conditions of project closeout. And unless all of those conditions have been met, then you can't close out the project quite yet. All right, but let's say all of those conditions are yet met. We're going to move on to other steps in the process. So again, this process includes a public hearing. Remember, this is the second public hearing that we've had for this grant, right? Because the first public hearing was during program startup to solicit input on community development and housing needs and activities, right? So we had that initial public hearing to get the needs assessment, and now we're having a project closeout public hearing. Public hearings should be held in conformance with your citizens participation plan. And there is a sample closeout public hearing advertisement in the KCDBG handbook, again, that's going to be very helpful to you. The second step in the project, the closeout process, is the project completion report form and the backup documentation that accompanies that. That PCR, as we're going to call it, does require information about the public hearing. So it really is the second step. You can't do the PCR without having done that second public hearing first. All right, so let's talk about the closeout public hearing. The purpose of this hearing is to advise citizens of the project completion and that it's ready to be closed out. The hearing must be advertised in the newspaper for at least 7 to 21 days prior to the date of the hearing. So it must be advertised at least 7 to 21 days prior to the date of the hearing. So no fewer than 7 days and no more than 21 days prior to the date of the hearing. All right, so additional steps should be taken to ensure that people who earn low to moderate income wages are able to attend, that the hearing is accessible for people living with disabilities, and that you're able to accommodate people with limited English proficiency if necessary. So there's this, again, I mentioned this before, there is a sample closeout public hearing advertisement document in the handbook that you will want to review. That's going to be very helpful to you. Make sure that you keep a record of the advertisement. You're going to need the tear sheet from the public hearing. You're going to need minutes from the public hearing, including any comments and responses. And you're also going to need a list of attendees from the public hearing. At the City of Columbia, we pretty much used the sign-in list, so had people sign their names and use that list as our list. All right, the next step in the process is the project completion report. So this is the PCR. PCR is attachment 13-2, and it includes 9 parts. It includes the certification sheet, and this is where you're going to certify compliance with the grant agreement. DLG is also going to certify approval of the PCR on that first sheet, that cover sheet, which is also the certification sheet. The financial summary includes information on each activity, accomplishments, the budget, expenditures, any unpaid obligations, and the national objectives that were met. So that's going to all be contained on the financial summary sheet. There is a project benefit profile by person. So this is the beneficiaries, your accomplishment data, and the beneficiaries of the project by specific demographic and income categories, because that's how we're going to put it back into IDIS to report back to HUD. For housing projects, you're going to use the project benefit profile by household, and that requires information on beneficiaries of housing projects, again, sorted by demographics and income categories. So the beneficiaries in this case is just the household rather than the individual. Okay, there's a job creation and retention category, which is a matrix that requires grantees to report the projection of actual versus projected numbers for jobs created, both overall and jobs created for people who earn low to moderate incomes. There's also a space for the grantee for you to describe any factors that impacted the actual number versus the projected number. So a place to explain if there were negative, impacts or positive things that helped and maybe you got more jobs created than you thought. Okay, there is um, a category for audit information. So here you'll have to supply information on the amount of the CDBG expenditures by fiscal year, as well as the total amount of federal awards totally for the fiscal year. That's going to determine whether or not that single audit is triggered, and Les talked about that either yesterday or the day before, um, and whether or not that audit has been submitted to the appropriate party. So that's going to be discussed in the audit information section. There's a section on unpaid costs and unsettled third-party claims, and that pretty much is what it is. List and explain any unpaid obligations or unsettled third-party claims resulting from the CDBG project. You're going to have a housing unit address information section, and for this is just for housing activities, providing the address of all the housing units assisted. There's a public facilities activities section where if you did a public facilities project, you would provide a detailed project description, including linear feet, pump stations, along with various documents. And then lastly, there is also a Section 3 compliance section here where you will report on your Section 3 compliance. That'll include total labor hours worked for the project, hours worked by Section 3 workers, and hours worked by targeted Section 3 workers on the project. Okay, so all of that is going to go into that project completion report. Some additional requirements of project closeout include public hearing documentation. We talked about that a little while ago. You need the tear sheet, you need the list of attendees, and you need the minutes from the meeting as well as comments and responses to the comments. You need any program income that was received. There's a miscellaneous revenue report in Chapter 3, and you'll need to report that. Also, updated one-for-one replacement summary report. Les talked about that yesterday, the one-for-one replacement, and saying where you put those units back into the affordable housing stock, the one-for-one replacement. All right, project completion. So once you've got all of your information, everything is done, you've checked all of your boxes, you're ready for closeout, you've done your public hearing, there's a two-step completion process. So DLG is going to send a notice of completion when they get that PCR and when they've reviewed it and it's approved. And then they're going to send a formal closeout letter when all the requirements are met. You want to retain those documents along with all of your other documents. I'll say it one last time for the end of the training. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen, and your file should read like a book. So maintain all of those, the documents for 5 years after project closeout. So again, not at the beginning of the project, but for 5 years from when you receive that formal closeout letter. All right, and one last item here is the change of use provision. So if you've done a project and you've used over $150,000 for this project and it involves real property, either acquired or improved with that $150,000, then you have to, there's a change in use provision. You can make it, you can offload it for a better use of lack of a better term. You can't change the use or planned use of the property unless DLG and the grantee provide the citizens with the affected citizens with reasonable notice and opportunity to comment on that change of use. But if after consultation with the citizens, DLG has determined that the change of use is necessary and appropriate, then you can dispose of the property if DLG is reimbursed in the amount of the current fair market value of the property, less any portion of the value attributable to expenditures of non-CDBG funds. So I apologize if you could hear the dogs there, but the new use has to be approved by DLG and meet a national objective, or you can pay back that fair market value of the property and kind of offload it that way. I hate to use that word, but that is the change of use provision. So 5 years to keep records and 5 years to make sure that the national objective is being met unless you do this change of use. Okay. All right. And that is it. We are at the end of the handbook. You guys have got lots of information over the last 3 days. I don't see any questions in the chat, Les. Am I
Yeah, you're right.
okay? All right.
So why don't we do this? If you want to advance to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the test. And then I've got a quiz that we can pull up and look at that. And then we'll just open it up for any other last questions for this. So again, I hope that with the way we have led you through the materials, with the quiz questions that we've provided you, that you are kind of calm about the test tomorrow, that there are a lot of things on the test that I would expect that you are going to look at the question and say, oh, I know the answer to that, and be able to answer that outright. And I think for the rest of things, you'll be able to look at that and say, oh, I understand what the topic is. So I understand where in the handbook to look. I understand where in the slides to look. This is a definition. I've got this glossary that has acronyms and terms defined. I've got a list of attachments. So I think I think for most all of you that you're going to be able to, for the ones that you're not sure about, you'll be able to track that down rather quickly and be able to define that and answer that. I will just share my test taking technique, which has worked well for me. Everybody has a different thing that works well for them. I go through the test, and the ones that I know that I'm very confident about, I actually put a little mark um, for myself that tells me that I don't need to go back and question that. And I think where people get themselves into trouble sometimes is instinctively they know, oh, I know that the trigger for a single agency audit is $750,000 expended in a fiscal year. They mark that answer. And then later they begin to think, do I know anything? You begin to question everything that you were thinking about. And I think people get themselves into trouble on that. And I think if you were researching every single one of these to look it up in the book or the slides, that's going to take time that you probably don't need on some of those. So I think ones that you're absolutely confident on, just mark them and remember that you don't need to go back to them and move on to the rest so that you can work through that. So, we talked about on the first day of things like that list of attachments, the table of contents, which would tell you what chapter talked about what, so you could kind of use that as a quick resource. You can use a printed out handbook if you printed it out. You can use it electronically. That's perfectly fine. We want part of the goal here is to have you know where things are and to be able to find them when you need them. So you're going to be asked questions about, some of those key rules, some of those key requirements. Hopefully, as you go through the test tomorrow, you'll be like, oh, wait a minute, Angela made a big issue about that. I remember that. I mean, we've tried to be as helpful as possible on these key items, and hopefully you're going to have some notes and arrows and things in your notes on that. So the window for this will open at 8:30 tomorrow morning. You will receive an email with it's a PDF, a fillable form. And so some things will be, you'll just click on and mark a little a dot for like a true false question, where you might be clicking and making a little X check mark when it's a multiple choice on that. There are a few where it's a fill in the blank sort of thing, short answer. We are not looking for, a paragraph. We're usually just looking for a couple of words, a quick statement. So don't, go too far on that. I would not anticipate that most folks will need anywhere near the amount of time that's been allowed for that. Jennifer or Andalyn or anybody, do you have other things you want to add to that before we go into the quiz section on this? Okay, I think then we're going to switch over. Um, Andalyn, I think you still have control. If you just click at the top where the slides are, the drop down arrow and the quizzes are loaded there also. I'll let you drive on
Okay.
this. So this isn't an exhaustive list of all the things that are important that we talked about today, but just some things that were talked about. So our first question is, does the 5-step decision process apply to all types of floodplains and wetlands? And Andela, if you want to take us to the answer page on that. So as Catherine talked about this morning, some projects are going to be following the 5-step requirement. Others have an additional 3 steps. So there are some that will have to follow the 8-step process. If you look in the chapter, and I believe it's 211 through 217, we go into a great deal of detail about floodplain requirements. And also that was in the slides this morning that Catherine was going through, and the posting. Everyone should have yesterday, kind of late, gotten the update on the invitation that would have the link for the recordings. And I would assume that this morning's recording is probably in there, and this afternoon's recording will be added a little bit after we finish up today. So you could also, if you wanted to, depending on what works best for you, you could go back and also listen to Catherine talking about the floodplain and wetlands review process on that. All right, next question. So you might be asked something similar to this on a number of categories where we're asking you name some of the elements of the environmental review record, the ERR. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to name every single one of them. A lot of times that question will say, give me 3 elements in that. So, read the question carefully to see what it's asking for. And so let's look at some of the elements that are included in that. So if we were looking at 2-2 and 2-3, it talks about that environmental review record includes that all important description of the project, probably is going to be backed up by maps and other information. There'd be an evaluation of the effect of the project, which is how we determine whether there are any negative impacts from that. There would be a written determination and documentation of compliance with the applicable statutes and authorities. So depending on the level of review that was being required, Catherine went through that in some of these are going to be subject to Part 58, others not. And so depending on the level of review would be the list of documentation that had been complied as part of that, and the written determination on each one of those categories. All right. So income eligibility, we talked a little bit about this in housing, which is where, for a lot of our activities, we're doing area benefit on this, or we might be doing something on job creation, but housing, we specifically are going to be doing income eligibility determinations on individual households. And so our question is, what definition of income are we required to use for the CDBG housing programs? And I'm hoping that most of you are just shouting out that answer, knowing it off the top of your head. So we talked about Section 8, or sometimes called Section 8, Part 5. And so we had good discussions today about, it's all of the income, both earned and unearned, including off of assets for all adult members. And then that also includes unearned income for minors. So I might have a child that was receiving SSI or child support or other sources of unearned income, and those we would also count because they are available to support that household. There's a reference in the chapter, but we went into some detail in slides 237 and 238 in today's discussion. All right, next question. So talking about housing. If I replace a substandard manufactured unit with a new manufactured unit for an eligible LMI homeowner, are we considering this rehabilitation or reconstruction? This is a little bit of a trick question, which I'll explain on that. So when we are, instead of rehabbing a unit, whether it was manufactured or whether it was a stick built, if we're going to replace that instead of rehabbing it, we're doing that under the allowance of being able to do reconstruction. And so for voluntary housing program, that's going to be a reconstruction activity. We talked about that on slide 230. The trick part of this is that essentially, I mentioned that with CDBG funds, we generally are not able to do any new construction with CDBG. So with this reconstruction, what CDBG has done is saying, we'll allow you to replace that unit using this reconstruction, and we're still going to call that a rehab activity. So it's still categorized as rehab because we couldn't allow you to do new construction for the most part. All right, next question, another housing question. So which of the following is not an acceptable form of ownership to qualify for housing assistance? And our options are fee simple title, legally recorded life estate, or a land contract. So the answer here is the land contract, because essentially they are making payments to the owner of record. That title is held in that owner's name until that final payment is made, and then that property would be deeded over to that person who's buying it. So if you hold that property under a land contract only, that land contract, you still aren't the owner, but you have I guess, a pathway to ownership. So you would not qualify for a homeowner assistance program because you don't technically qualify. We talked a little bit about that. Life estate is when the ownership, the deed, has actually transferred to someone else. But as part of that legal transaction, they have recorded a life estate right. So you, during your lifetime, can legally occupy. You have a right that can't be taken away from you to occupy that property. And so we do still recognize that as a form of ownership, even though in this case, that deed has transferred over and is in someone else's name at that point. All right, let's talk about the national objective when we're dealing with housing. This is an important point that we talked about. How do we, what's the criteria to meet the national objective when we're doing housing? So let's look at the answer on this. So we have three options here. If we're dealing with a single family unit, that single family unit must always be occupied by an LMI household to be eligible. If we have a double, then half of that. We can't really do the 51% very well in a 2-unit structure. And then at 3 units or more, we have to have that 51% of those units are occupied by an LMI household. That's covered on slide 232 and also in some detail in chapter 10. All right. Question about this has to do with the age of the unit. For a unit constructed prior to 1978, what exceptions would apply for rehabilitation work? And this really should say triggering the lead safe housing rule, because that's our key here is if we've got a unit that was constructed prior to 1978, we normally are going to have to meet that lead safe housing rule. So the exceptions on having to comply with the lead safe housing rule, we could have a property that we conducted testing or we had evidence of someone else completing testing, and we could document that there was no lead in that property. We also might have a property that full abatement had been done, and we had documentation of that. And we talked about, owners are being required to disclose when they sell a property. So holding on to that paperwork, we could have a homeowner that applies for rehabilitation assistance, and perhaps that property earlier, maybe even under an earlier owner, had abatement done, and we had that information. We would then be able to say, okay, this property is exempt because it's already been handled. Probably the most common exemption that we would see on this is where we're doing pretty limited rehab on this, and we're able to look at that scope of work and be able to say, we're not actually touching any painted surfaces, and so we're going to be exempt from the lead safe housing rule. We talk about this on slide 243, and also there's an attachment 14, which covers whether you meet these exemptions from the lead safe housing rule. And I will say that the questions on the test are not as poorly constructed as this one was. Then we're turning to economic development. So we talked about job pirating, and we want to know, what are we talking about? What's the definition of job pirating? So our answer here is that job pirating is when we've used CDBG funds, we're relocating a company, and we're going to have job loss that's going to be considered significant in that original community. We're not going to ask you, we did talk about in this session about that being either 500 or more jobs or 0.1% or more of the local workforce. We're going to ask you that level of detail in the question, but we could ask you about job pirating. So the task for that grant administrator and working on a project like this is trying to determine, is there the potential that what we're doing here is causing a job loss somewhere else? Be able to document that in the file. There's more detail in chapter 11. There is information on slides 262. All right. And then questions about what's the standard to meet the national objective for LMI job creation or retention? This is a pretty important one. So if we are going to meet that job creation or retention, we need at the completion of that project to be able to show, and this is for the national objective part of this, that we either created or retained, and this is full-time equivalent permanent jobs, that 51% of those are being held by low or low mod income persons. So we did spend time talking about there's a separate test in addition to that about the public benefit standard, which kind of limits the amount of money that we can justify. But to make sure that we met the national objective, we're looking at the numbers that were created or retained, and then we have to be at 51%. I'll just remind you that when we're talking about creation, we would be looking at the point that you funded that company, how many employees were on the payroll at the beginning of this project versus at the end of the project. If they had 50 employees and they now have 75 employees on the payroll, then we have 25 additional jobs that have been created. You sometimes will have someone that I've got 50 existing jobs. I keep hiring people, but that's because I hired 2 people, one of them left, I hired another one, then somebody else left. So it's looking at those cumulative totals is how we get to the number of jobs. And if we're talking about retained, we're going to have that documentation to show that if it wasn't for our investment, that those jobs would have been lost. All right, we can go to the next question. So here's that other part that we spent quite a bit of time today talking about. So we know we have to meet national objective, but we also have to meet this standard test for the public benefit standard. So we're being asked, what are those two tests that we're going to be calculating compliance on for the public benefit standard? All right, so we talked about that we've got two separate tests. The first of these is the dollars per job, and we've got a $20,000 cap of investment per job. For goods and services, we have a separate test that's being done. That's $350 per person. So we talked about establishing the service area, figuring out how many LMI individuals are in that service area. So we're using census data for the most part on that. And then we would be able to multiply the number of LMI individuals times that $350 per person to be able to determine then what's my maximum investment I'd be able to make on that. So we're going to run that calculation at the beginning of the project as to help us determine how much money could we provide on this. We have to meet one of these, only one of these, so we could miss on one and hit the other and be okay. And then we talked a little bit about, and a good conversation about, what happens if I have a project that, they were held to creating a certain number of jobs and they fail to meet that. And that's where in a compliance issue at the end of the project, we might be saying to them, okay, you missed the needed number of jobs being created to justify under the national objective our investment of dollars. And so we could be triggering a repayment for some portion of the funds on that. Okay. Question about amendments. Anlin, I'll let you take this one.
Thank you. All right, so what steps are triggered if an amendment is determined by DLG to be a substantial amendment? So we talked about amendment can be an amendment or it can be a substantial amendment. So what steps are triggered if that amendment is determined by DLG to be a substantial amendment? I'd like to give it a couple seconds. All right. So substantial amendments may trigger additional steps like that state clearinghouse assurance, maybe having to be updated or redone. The public hearing, Title I of the Community Development Act says that citizens must have reasonable time and notice to comment on changes to a CDBG funded project. The environmental review, remember we were doing a project and then there was this whole daylighting of a stream at the same location by the same people, and so we had to include that in our environmental review and had to stop work and do it all over again. So the answer to this is in chapter 12. You can also see slide 285 for more information on things that may be triggered by a substantial amendment. All right. And I think that is our last question.
Thought it might be.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't see any additional questions in either the chat or the inbox. I'm just going to suggest to folks that you spend some time, look through the materials that have been provided, look through your notes, look through the chapter, get a good night's sleep. And I think really importantly, as you begin that test, don't just jump to the answer. Read that question carefully. There are no trick questions. We're not trying to, we could make much more complicated questions, but we were trying to lead you to the right answer here. So just read the question, understand it, and then look for the correct, obvious answers on that. So there's not a there's a chat in here asking about, is there a website for the test? You're going to be sent a PDF fillable form, and then you will be able to email that back. So it's not that there's like a website that's been created with like a live test feed as part of that. That's I think a little beyond our scope here probably.
Right, and I don't see any
And
questions.
there was an updated, there's a question or a chat about updated recording sessions. There was an updated invite that was sent out yesterday, calendar invite that has the link on that. It would be great if somebody can respond in the chat saying, yes, I did get that or I saw that. So the recording sessions, when it was sent out yesterday, it had both sessions, morning and afternoon, were loaded to that link for Monday and the morning session for Tuesday, and they were expecting to be loading the Tuesday afternoon session shortly on that. So I would presume that at this point, that link should provide you access to everything except today's afternoon session, and that will be loaded probably within an hour or so to that.
Okay. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A right now, but I did want to put it on this question slide and just give us a couple of minutes and encourage you to ask any questions. If you have any ahead of tomorrow, we definitely want to make sure that we answer all your questions.
So there's a question here about asking, will it come prior to 8:30? My understanding would be the window will open that you'll receive that at 8:30. So I would then recommend that if at 8:30 you have not received a communication, I would contact DLG and say, hey, and last year we had just a couple of folks that had some technical issues, and I think we solved every one of those. Actually, I think Jennifer solved each one of those. So you should have that at 8:30 and then be able to proceed with that on that.
Yeah, I'll probably get it out a few minutes before because just to give it time to, get through cyberspace. It could be a little slow, so I'll probably try to send it about 8:20. If by some chance you do not get it, my email is jennifer.peters@ky.gov. And then I'll have you instructions in there how to proceed.
Great. So Angela and I will not be seeing you tomorrow or with you, but you will be in our thoughts. And I'm hopeful that you will be like thanking us at the end, sending us a verbal thank you that, oh, thank you. You made a big point about something and I remember it. So we wish you all luck.
Hope that
there was a question that popped up about there was a housing question came in.
With a housing rehab project, will the grantee have to do a title search or does the owner provide the deed?
It would be done by the grant administrator. Generally, that's how it was done. And you might talk with Travis about that on their expectations, but generally it's going to be done by the grant administrator.
It's a really good question. Okay. I wish you all the most luck tomorrow, and I know that you'll all do great. And thank you guys so much.
I want to thank you too, y'all. Everybody, y'all have been great as always. We appreciate this very, very much. I hope everybody does well tomorrow on the test. I just put my email in the chat for you so you can reach out to me if you need. And if for some reason you did not receive direct links on these webinars this time, I know we had to add a few yesterday. So for some reason you did not get those directly from ICF this week, if you'll just send me an email and I'll make sure that I have you in the email for tomorrow morning.
One final question did come in. I'm sorry, I want to make sure we get to all of them. Will there be a retest option?
A retest option as in if you don't pass and you want to retake the test?
Yeah, I think that's.
I don't know. I don't know that we would discuss it. or if it was like, if you can't take it tomorrow and you need to reschedule it, we'll definitely work that out.
Okay. All right. And
Les, Andalyn, y'all been great.
Thank you. And thank you for this is always a partnership. So thanks everybody. All right. Well, good luck tomorrow. Good night's sleep. Well hydrated. Don't panic and you'll be just fine.
Study, study, study.
All right. Take care.
Bye, everybody.